Revenge of the Vigilantes. Revenge of the Vigilantes. After the pick-handle vigilantes made their official appearance, one newspaper described them as consisting of 100 or more loyal woodworkers, incensed by the attacks on logging trucks. Some of them reportedly got their pick handles at the hardware store in Wakefield. The events that took place in Marinesco on the 30th of June spurred the vigilantes into action. They met at the Gogebic County Fairgrounds later that day, where they are said to have had a supply of beer and alcohol to fortify them for their assault later that night. About 5 p.m. on the 30th of June, John Mackey went to the police department in Ironwood and warned Chief Arnie Kuhansen, "There's a raid planned for the Palace Hall between 7 and 8 o'clock this evening. The guys who are planning it are getting it together at Longyear Park." The chief made several trips to the park at Hall, but did not notice any unusual activity. The officers were instructed to make more than usual number of trips on patrol. A dance was held at Palace Hall that evening, and a city policeman stayed there until it was over. Chief Kuhansen last checked on the Palace Hall at 11:10 p.m. There are apparently from 50 to 100 men involved, many drawn from the Legion and the lumber industry. They tied bands of white cloth around their arms before setting out in order to identify each other to avoid casualties in friendly fire. Frank Hadwick, a caretaker of the fairgrounds, witnessed their activities and would later be called to testify. Through a combination of civic resolutions, newspaper reports, state protected of scab truck drivers, and the provoking of large-scale assault on logging trucks on the 30th of June, the strike situation was brought to a climax. On the evening of the 30th of June, and early morning hours of the 1st of July, attacks took place at the Union or Thiel building in the halls in Ironwood and Bessemer. On the evening of the 30th of June, James Rogers, Henry Paul, and Luke Rake met with Nathaniel Clark, a regional director of the National Labor Relations Board, in Ironwood. 10 minutes after the meeting with Clark, the men were attacked in a restaurant. Luke Rake's deposition stated, "We were going to the office to fill out petition, and on our way down, Paul suggests we have a bite to eat. We were in the lunchroom across from the Union office on Lowell Street. There we ordered lunch. When we were just about half through eating, a mob had come in with axe handles and pick handles, about 10 or 20 men. They hollered, 'Here they are.' One hollered, 'Here's the president of the union.' Another said, 'Here is the attorney too.' So they ordered us out right away. Some suggested to take us over the pond, and I said in a joking way, 'Wait till we get ready.' At that point, someone hit me with a club, and I was about dragged out of the booth." James Rogers told the newspaper, "We had gotten our food when the mob, about 50 men, came in the restaurant. Without a word, one of the men struck Paul with an axe handle, and some of the others grabbed him, knocked him down, and dragged him out the door. Then, when they got outside, they came back and dragged Paul, both Rake and myself out, clubbing and kicking us as we were dragged." Luke Rake testified, "Paul Rogers and I were alone in the restaurant and had no weapons of any kind. When they got me out of the booth, they had gotten Paul out already. When I was in the door, I seen Paul laying on the sidewalk, the men kicking and clubbing him. The men who were kicking and clubbing Paul had white bands on their arms." Rogers said, "In the meantime, Paul tried to get away. But after he had run about 100 feet, one of the men caught him and clubbed him down. Some others started to kick him. Some women standing on the street corner shouted protests, but they were told to mind their own business." Luke Rake said, "Then they started kicking me again, and they quit clubbing me, and I noticed Paul running around the street. I saw Paul on the main street in the corner being kicked again. The same group of men were clubbing him. At the time, I was held by a bunch of men, 10 or 15 men. Then I saw a group of men carrying Paul and pushing him across the street and got him into a car. I saw a man standing on the driver's side of the car. This is Bill Weston. I see him pull Paul into the car. At the same time, they grabbed me into the car with a man in the back seat with a club in his hand. This man was Allen. One of the men I did not recognize. 2 men were out running the board, holding their clubs. I pleaded for mercy. They started the car off, circling around the streets of Ironwood, and when we were taken over the border into Wisconsin. On the way, they threatened to kill me and throw me over the bridge. I was bleeding quite heavily and asked that I might spit, but they wouldn't let me spit out the window or on the floor. I was not allowed to move nowhere. When they got to Saxon, we stopped at the gas station. We were short of gas, and they would kill me if I opened my mouth, but the gas station was closed. The car said they said never to come back to the state of Michigan. Allen did the talking. First, they suggested they would take my hide off, and they threatened to tar and feather me. And when I pleaded that I wouldn't come back to the state of Michigan, they said that if I did, I would be in a casket. Before we came back to the gas station, they were going at a high speed. The car was a dark color, and I think it was the Chevrolet Coach. They caught up to the other car and said it was Paul. One said, "Here is Paul. We will treat them both alike." We followed Weston car up to the gas station, and the car ahead of us pulled out to the left side of the road. And our car stopped at the gas station. They said if I opened my mouth, they would kill me. When it came, we came to the railroad tracks, and there was a bunch of men there. They opened the door like wild men and wanted to drag me out. I recognized Bill Weston. I know him for 15 years or more. This man was going to club me, but Alan hollered that he was still the leader of this mob and that they opened the door and got me out of his side of the car. When they got out, they tried to hit me again with clubs. When they beat me plenty, they said, "Your partner Paul is going up the road and you should follow his tracks." Roger saved me from a serious beating due to his being an Indian and a ward of the government. Henry Paul described the beating and kidnapping in the letter sent to Nathaniel Clark quoted in a Bernhardt history. They began driving me out of town, and a jobber of the same note told me that they were going to run me out of town and I should never come back. I told them I was badly hurt and should be brought to a doctor as quickly as possible. He said, "I haven't got a goddamn bit of sympathy for you. Not a damn bit. We're going to break this strike and we're going to run out of every one of your gang. Us Americans aren't going to stand for a bunch of foreigners stomping your trucks and keeping us from hauling and talking bread from our babies' mouths. You can bet your life we are going to haul tomorrow. We're not going to finish up these bulls tonight, and they won't be able to interfere with us anymore." Rake and Weston told him, "Luke, when I was down to your office, I told you I was coming down to collect, and I said I wouldn't fool. Don't you ever come back to the state of Michigan anymore." Rake walked to Saxon and went down to the same house where Paul was taking refuge. The owner let him in, and Rake and Paul washing blood off his face. The men went next door to use the neighbor's telephone and call Mrs. Paul. They paid the neighbor $10 to drive them back to Hurley, and they tried to drive them back to Hurley, where they tried to contact Dr. Bonacci, the mayor. He didn't come, so they called Dr. Gertz in Ironwood. Dr. Gertz saw Paul and advised him to go to the hospital in Ashland, 50 miles away, for treatment of his injuries. A convoy of 3 Union cars drove the injured men to Ashland, and they arrived there at 4 a.m. After dropping Paul off at the hospital, Rake and other men immediately drove back to the palace in Ironwood. Rake made an appointment to meet with Nathaniel Clark of the NLRB at 1:30 p.m. at the St. James Hotel. He and Matt Savila, Wilho Wikila, took a walk over to the eat shop and later visited the union office to check out the damage. Rake described the office in a deposition. "When we came to the office, it was all cleared out. Desk, telephone, etc. A man was working in the office. He tried to find out where our stuff was. At the same time, Bill Weston came over again. I could see him coming across the street and could see a group of men at Dodge Motor Sales. Bill said to me, 'I'll give you 20 minutes to leave the state.' I told him I would. After I was getting in the car, came back to me and said, 'There's one more thing I wish you would do. When you leave the state, call Marinesco and tell them to call the strike off the strike.' I said I would do that. Instead of going over to Wisconsin, we stopped at the gas station and filling up with gas, oil, and water, and then went to Marinesco. The kidnapping took place at 11 p.m. at the Eat Shop, located at 117 South Lowell Street. Fred Teal, owner of the building housing and union headquarters, recognized several of the raiders as local men and said he would sign complaints. So here's the log loading cars. And here is the attacks on the halls. The Lumberjacks were minding their own business at the Swede Finn Hall in Bessemer that evening, laying on the ground after having their meetings when businessmen attacked them with axe handles and sticks and beat the daylights out of those poor guys. I don't know if the Bessemer police intervened to stop the attack. Around midnight, the morning of the 1st of July, cars full of vigilantes arrived from all directions and smashed windows to the Swede Finn Hall in Bessemer. 9 of the 15 windows were broken and several strikers were beaten. John McGonigal had asked the sheriff department, city police, and state police for protection, but none was forthcoming. The vigilantes forced some lumberjacks to run a gauntlet in front of the hall and beat them with what clubs. One lumberjack, Charles Randa, was later taken to the hospital in Ironwood, where he received 8 stitches on his scalp. According to Elmer Erickson, there are 16 vigilantes involved in the attack on the Swede Finn Hall. As soon as they arrived, they began breaking windows. A neighbor, Dave Tapani Havala, who lived next door, the 801 Hematite, came outside and carrying a shotgun. He warned the vigilantes not to step foot on his property or he would shoot them. Mr. Havala tried to protect the lumberjacks until they could go back to the woods. At 1:30 a.m., vigilantes arrived at the Palace Hall in Ironwood. Oliver Peltor was in charge of the building and requested police protection. A crowd was gathered in front of the hall. 25 or 30 strikers were ordered to leave the hall and marched in solemn procession west towards Hurley. City Commissioner Joseph P. Meiger was present when the attack and showed up and was later commended by Raymond Garvey for his courage in going before the throng at the Palace Hall when the disturbance took place. There's some more lumberjacks lumberjacking. Beating at Alligator Point. Axel Savala, 40-year-old chairman of the strike committee in Ontonagon County, a lumberjack military veteran and resident of the county since 1903, was driving to Marinesco on the morning of the 1st of July. He had 2 passengers, one of whom was the mining inspector of Ontonagon County, Sheriff Deputy Richard Koski. Koski was 51 years old and needed a ride to Ironwood to consummate the sale of his cattle. He was about his sons and truck. He wasn't aware of it yet, but they had been picked up by the police in Marinesco attack and were incarcerated in Bessemer. The third passenger was 25-year-old Omni Manico, a clean-cut young man who resided in Ontonagon County for most of his life. The account which follows is derived from the testimony of Savala, Koski, and Manico. About 10 a.m., they noticed some police cars and slowed down from 40 to 20 miles an hour. They followed us for a little while, so one of the cars pulled alongside and a shotgun pointed towards their direction from inside the police car. They were told to stop. The Ironwood Daily Globe carried a brief account of this affair. It reported that men were arrested after Koski tried to stop a state police car from passing their car. Nothing was mentioned about the beatings that the men said they endured. Savala pulled his 1937 Ford V8 off the shoulder of the road near Alligator Point. Corporal Fred Ennis of the state police was charged and was accompanied by sheriff deputies named Mackey and Soprani. The police car parked in front of Savala vehicle, and the police jumped out and started using profane language, running to encircle the car. The men inside were not giving a chance to say anything. Corporal Ennis reportedly shouted, "Let's kill them," as 3 men were dragged out of the car. The officers were armed with 3-foot clubs. They called us rats and all kinds of dirty names, Koski testified. The officers began pummeling and kicking Savala, who asked them not to hit him. He took the attack and was beaten and began to pass out. Koski saw the officers strike Savala's hip with the dull side of a poleaxe and witnessed one of the officers jump on the Savala with both feet. Savala probably suffered the most during the attack because the police apparently mistook him for Matt Savala, the head of the attack strike. Manico was beaten until he fell into the ditch at the side of the highway, where he was kicked and punched. There's Koski and his wife Josephine. Koski testified that the officers were excited that they were hitting each other in their frenzy to beat the 3 of the men. Everybody was trying to get at Savala. He was full of blood. Koski tried to keep away from the men and was sat on the running board of the car until one of the officers knocked him off into the sand. "Why are you doing this? I didn't hurt anybody," he protested. "The sheriff of Ontonagon is looking for you," the policeman replied. Koski, who suffered from heart trouble, was struck on both sides and had one of his teeth kicked out and his eyes blackened. He was finally punched in the head and fell to the ground unconscious. The officers took about 3 rests between the beatings, according to Koski. After the beating stopped, the men were driven to where the rest of the police were. Deputy George Rat Sopranani did some of the beating, I am sure, Koski testified. The officers held a little meeting to try to decide what to do with us. The beatings resumed, and Savala was struck many times around his face with clubs, and one of the police officers put a 3-inch gash on his head with an axe. They used everything except I couldn't see out of my eyes and could hardly open my mouth because it was so swollen. Manico had one of his ribs broken in the second round of the beatings. The men were chased into Lake Gogebic to wash the blood from their clothing and were beaten until they were beyond the reach of the police. Don't look back, they were told. Go in deeper. Manico had to dodge an axe-wielding officer as he waded out into the lake. Savile and Manico were forced to stay in the water up to their necks for more than an hour. Koski was forced up to his knees. When the three men were allowed to come back to shore, Savile had so much blood in his eyes and was so disoriented that he couldn't see to go in the right direction. Koski called to him so he could find his way out. Koski testified, my heart was pounding something awful. That cold water made me feel sick. An officer tore apart an old shirt and gave pieces to the men so they could tie up their wounds. Then one of the police told Koski, sell your property and get out of the country or you'll find a noose around your neck. After three men were allowed to come out of the water, they were shaking so much they could hardly get the handcuffs on us, according to Koski. They were all handcuffed and placed in the back of Savile's automobile. Koski was the first to enter the car. Savile and Manico were kicked as they got in. Savile's car was then vandalized with clubs and windows were broken, except the front ones, which were down. Shards of broken glass flew in the men's faces. By noon, the men were in jail at Bessemer. The same police that had been hitting us questioned us. They stayed pretty far away so they couldn't see them very good. Savile requested medical attention and was taken to Grandview Hospital for stitches and x-rays and was treated by Dr. Tew. The next morning, his eyes were swollen shut and he couldn't open them. His body was covered with bruises from the heavy beating he took. Koski found his son at the jail at Bessemer. When he saw me, I thought I had come to meet him. I thought the same thing. The charges against him. I knew I was sick by looking at me. My face was smashed too. After the beating, Koski was out of breath. He visited Dr. Bagley in Duluth and was told it was due to a bad blow he received under his heart. The three men were not provided with legal representation and were imprisoned for almost 3 days. Prosecutor McDonald told them, I'm going to let you boys off. There's no charge as long as you leave the county. Manico responded, we have a right to travel in different counties and our own personal business. I don't see any reason why we stopped. McManus replied, you can travel here on your own personal business, but not on strike business. Koski said, I don't think that's fair. I didn't violate any law or hurt anybody. I think I'm entitled to go any place. I didn't come here on strike business. I came here on personal business to sell my cattle. McMahon told them, well, you're entitled to come here at any time. They were released at 2:30 on Saturday. Savile testified to the governor's committee, none of us had been drinking. I wasn't driving recklessly. I was driving around 40 miles an hour. When I saw the police, I slowed down to 20 miles per hour. All of Savile's personal belongings were removed from his car and the tires were slashed. The Daily Globe reported Savile had pled guilty to reckless driving and been sentenced to serve 30 days, but Savile was out of jail already, and by the Sunday after his arrest, one of my tires blew up Sunday, and they had cut it with an axe. Koski said that the unions were really pushed down. His daughter, Martha, recalled. There's one more loader.